Well, welcome to our webinar featuring an overview and questions and answers about recent shifts in America's largest Protestant churches. I'm co-author Dr. Warren Bird, Research Director at Leadership Network, and momentarily I'll segue to Dr. Scott Thumma, the Director of the Hartford Institute for Religion Research out of Hartford Seminary. And our report that we're going to be talking about is available for free download at leadnet.org/megachurch, one word, or hartfordinstitute.org, both our websites. And both our websites offer a host of other studies, resources, information about very large churches. First, a quick word about the background of the report you're going to see in the EndNote section. All of this is said, but the gist is the trends you're about to hear come from a recent survey conducted 2015, and it's parallel to surveys we conducted in 2000, 2005, 2008, 2010. And for the 2015 version, this that we'll be talking about, we emailed and snail mailed all 1,650 megachurches in the United States. And by megachurch, we mean a Protestant church with 2,000 or more adults and children in regular weekend worship attendance, all physical campuses combined. And then plus we emailed a bunch of other churches in the 1,000 to 1999 range for various reasons, both to compare and also to, in case there are some that had grown into the 2,000 range. Then for our report, we studied those with attendances of 1,800 and higher, which we had done for the previous 4 national studies. And in doing so, we had a 13% response rate. Okay, we also weighted those responses to be more representative of all megachurches. Okay, that's all the technical stuff. It's in the report. Now, Dr. Scott Thumma will give you a quick overview of some of the key findings, and I'll join in, and then we will look forward to fielding your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bird. Let me get the screen.
Over to.
Yep. All right. Well, one of the things that we wanted to do in this report was to remind people of basic characteristics of megachurches. But we also wanted to try to do a few other things. We wanted to follow the existing trends that we'd been seeing across the different surveys that we've done. But then we also wanted to dig a little deeper to see what it told us about the state of large churches and to see if there were any helpful directions that we might be able to pull out from some of that data. So if we could go to the next slide, I will talk a little bit first about the continuing characteristics of megachurches. You know, all the time that we've done research, we've talked about megachurches are not necessarily better than other size congregations, but they are absolutely distinctively different from other churches. And this slide shows one of those ways. They are growing faster than almost any other congregations in the country. You can see the vast majority of the congregations are growing double digit over the past 5 years. Although it is clear that some of them are declining. But that's a relatively low percentage, especially when compared to the rest of the country. On the next slide, you'll see another way that they're significantly different, and that is their worship is described in much more positive characteristics than other congregations from a 2015 study in Faith Communities Today research that we paralleled. They are more inspirational, they're more joyful, they are more innovative and nurturing of people than a typical congregation in that study. Not only that, the next slide shows that in fact the culture of a megachurch and the dynamics in its congregation is really perceived as more vital. If you can see that slide, you can get a sense of this, and all of these images are in the report as well. It's absolutely clear that megachurches are known for having a more clear sense of mission and purpose than the typical congregation, and they're also more willing to meet challenges and perceived as spiritually vital and alive. Now, all of these things we've kind of followed, and they've been strong the whole way throughout our research. But we also wanted to follow some trends that we've been seeing over the past 15 years. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see one of those is quite dramatic, and that is the number of megachurches that are adopting a kind of multi-site strategy. That is, one congregation in multiple locations. Not only has it grown significantly in the last 5 years from 46% of the megachurches to 62% now, it also has increased by the number of sites from 2.5 to 3.5, I believe it is, and more services as well. So they're finding ways to diversify and grow larger by, in fact, growing smaller. That also has the other side of that is the typical size of the main worship sanctuary has decreased. In fact, in the last 5 years, it's decreased by about 300 seats. It's quite a dramatic change. Not only that, if you go to the next slide, you'll see there's a continuing decline of traditional worship styles. We've noticed this for the last decade or more. The use of organ has continued to go down, likewise the use of choirs, except for about 15 to 30% who use it all the time. So there is no one consistent picture of megachurches, but in fact there's some diversity. But nevertheless, the larger trend is away from this type of worship. Another characteristic that we've been watching but really surprised us some is shown on this next slide, and that is a significant shift coming out of the building. I mean, there was a time 20 plus years ago that megachurches focused inwardly to try to figure out how to do church. Well, now they're clearly outside the walls and becoming much more missional. We ask questions about how much they spend on missions in their budget, and it rose from 10% of their budget to 14% this time. We also asked some specific questions about global missions and what an emphasis that was. And for 81% of the megachurches we looked at, they said that global missions was either a major emphasis or it was a specialty of that congregation. This was quite significant, and it's even more significant when you think about it in relation to the slide that you're looking at. The more you emphasize the global mission emphasis in your congregation, the more likely your people are to give. I think people are conditioned to want to give to causes and efforts around the world to do missions are what driving some of that giving. Not only that, another thing that we've watched in megachurches is the tremendous diversity within the congregation. And the next slide will show some of that, but it has always surprised us just how racially diverse megachurches are. The perception is not that, but in fact, 10% of the megachurches that we surveyed this time said that they had no majority racial group, that they were quite diverse. And nearly 50% of our sample had 20% or more racial diversity in it. It's quite staggering compared to, again, the overall profile of American religious life. And then finally, we also looked at the perceptions of financial health on the next slide. And in fact, that it shows that these churches have clearly recovered from the recession. The perception that they are healthy has gone up about 13% since the last time we did the survey. But there's also some gray, there's not a silver lining with this. In fact, the actual income is relatively flat across the years that we've looked at it. And if you factored in how the economy has changed, it's actually probably not flat, but actually a loss a little bit. And that led us to begin to think about some other questions. Are there some warning signs or kind of looming challenges for the megachurches? You know, they're often perceived as highly successful and kind of immune to the troubles of smaller congregations. But our research is beginning to show that they too are feeling some of the spiritually corrosive effects of contemporary social change and cultural shifts. And this next slide shows some of that. One of the things that we tried to do was to calculate percent of engaged people. That is, how many people say they're a total participant over and against how many actually come to weekly worship. And you can see that it has been declining, especially in 2010 and 2015. Now, we're not quite sure what to make of that, but in fact, a lot of research across the country shows that active participants are attending less regularly. They still may consider themselves weekly attenders, but they may only show up 2 times a month, 3 times a month. And that seems to be the case of what's happening in megachurches too. The active participants have continued to grow, but the weekly worship attendance hasn't. And therefore you have, in a sense, fewer engaged people. If you switch to the next slide, you can also see another challenge, I think, for megachurches. While they're going out in the mission field and thinking of that as a very important component, and as well also in their local community doing missions, they seem to be doing it more by themselves. We noticed a considerable drop in how much megachurches were engaged with other congregations around them, both other Christian congregations, but also other faith traditions. And we switch to the next slide. This is probably somewhat troubling, more so than any of the other slides. We saw this significant drop-off in the number of megachurches that said they strongly agreed that they're willing to change to meet new challenges. Now, for a very long time, that was, and still is, a hallmark of megachurches. They have always excelled at this, more so than congregations of other sizes. But you see this significant drop-off this time in the research. You go to the next slide. The other thing we asked this time for the first time was how much conflict megachurches have. So we have nothing to compare it with across time, but with other congregations that were asked the same question this year, you can see that megachurches have slightly less overall conflict, but when they do have conflict, it can sometimes have greater consequences, such as the loss of money and also staff or clergy leaving in some instances. And then finally, the last slide shows some interesting research that we're going to continue to work with, and that is the idea that the longer the tenure of the senior pastor, and the senior pastor continuing to minister beyond the age of 60, seem to have some detrimental effects to the congregation's dynamics. We also looked at that in smaller congregations, and in fact, megachurches fare a bit better than smaller congregations. But it is something to think about, both in terms of questions of succession, but also how do you reinvent yourself when you're saying that you're less likely to want to change to meet challenges. These are compounding issues, we believe. So there's a lot of interesting trends going on, but we also have some positive things, I think, from the data that shows ways out of this. And I'll let Warren speak some more about that. So Dr. Bird, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Scott Thumma from the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. And now just a few slides with some brighter signs, for example, and some possible solutions. For example, the more intentional a church was to employ small groups, if we can have the next slide, please, and make them work, the greater the likelihood they were to see themselves as spiritually vital and alive. So in other words, we asked the self-assessment, how vital and alive would you say your congregation is? And of those who strongly agreed, we looked at those who used small groups. And as you can see from the slide, a clear straight line progression. Or next slide, the more a congregation put emphasis on having internal structures of accountability, then should be no surprise, but now we've documented it, the larger the percentage of its members that were engaged and active participants. And the challenge of any church, and especially a megachurch, is how do you move people from spectator to participant? You want spectators, you want the come and see crowd, but how do you then help them engage? And this was a signal, this question, for how you do accountability. And finally, next slide, the more young adult, and this again is a no-brainer, but we've documented it here because megachurches do very well, comparatively speaking, with reaching millennials, young adults. And the more those churches say it's a priority, the greater the likelihood of having a large percentage of young adults in the congregation. So these speak well of the future. Some people say, well, megachurches, they're just a boomer phenomenon. Absolutely not, both in who goes to megachurches and who leads megachurches. There's a whole new generation rising. Okay, well, now we're going to transition over to the Q&A. And the first Q&A it gets to come from our report sponsor. You've enjoyed these lovely graphics. That's part of what their funding helped underwrite. And I'm going to talk to Tom Greenwood, who I love his title, is the Director of Faith-Based Design. The Beck Group is a huge company that has many aspects, but they've got one focused just on faith-based initiatives. And so Tom Greenwood, how has the Beck Group been associated with large churches over the years?
Well, first of all, thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of sponsoring this research. We do think it's really vital to our work because for the last, coming up on 20 years, actually, we've been associated with the design and construction of megachurches all over the U.S. and around the world. And we've been really privileged to kind of be on the front doorstep, we think, in a lot of cases of churches that have been pushing innovative ideas in the megachurch world, whether it's incorporating technology in new ways, whether it's the multi-site model or it's doing urban and global megachurches with work that we're seeing now in places like South Korea. So this is a vital part of what we're doing.
Yes, and when I met with you in your Dallas office and I mentioned a recent trip to Korea to visit megachurches, you whipped out this portfolio and you're like, well, yeah, we designed a bunch of them, and you showed me some gorgeous shots. One more question to you, Tom Greenwood. Which of the study's findings is most relevant to what the Beck Group does with large churches?
Well, there are a lot of great things that we're going to have to look at the implications of, but one that jumps out to us, obviously, in the decreasing size of worship venues that you're continuing to see. I think there is a relationship certainly to the multi-site model, which is also a major trend. But we also think there's a corollary to the need for engagement that churches see to build engagement, connections, and it's a parallel to what we're seeing from our clients who want to build smaller venues to provide better ways in which to connect and to build spaces even outside of the worship venues that are relative to encouraging more engagement and connection with their communities.
Great. Thank you. And now let's open it up to others to ask questions. If you'll use the raise your hand function, we'll unmute you and we'll see you if you show your video, and we can have a dialogue. If you want to address your question to Scott Thumma, or Warren Bird, or even Tom Greenwood, we'd love to answer your questions. So let's see how our technology works, and let's see who would like to raise the first question. And you also see that we're available offline for one-on-ones. You may have seen the report this morning by Christianity Today and Religion News Service, among others, and the quotes and the stuff that they built into their wonderful reports came from the one-on-one interviews. So you're welcome to ask those questions now, or if you prefer to privately, we can be available. All right. Who is first? And how should we handle this? All right. So while we're setting up, one of the questions that I was asked on different, and be sure, oh, by the way, when you ask your question, to turn on your video and your audio. And I'm getting an in-house note here that we're having some trouble connecting. So let me just verbalize one of the questions we were asked yesterday in some of the press interviews as we released the report early to some of the reporters. What finding did we think was most significant? And my take on it, and Scott Thumma, maybe you want to add your take, is the one that I put in the infographic on page 1. And by the way, that infographic is a separate. If you want to download just the infographic by itself, go to leadnet.org/megachurch, and beneath the section of downloading the report, you'll just see a click here just to download the infographic. But on that infographic, a question of, do you strongly agree, or do you agree, to what extent or disagree, that your church has a clear mission and purpose? And 79% of megachurches strongly agreed that they have a clear mission and purpose. And by contrast, and not to put down any other size of church, but only 41% of non-megachurches strongly agreed that they had clear mission and purpose. And to me, that is absolutely surprising and confirming that megachurches have a clear direction, and they know why they exist, and they know why they're uniquely there. Scott, you want to add to that?
Well, that's certainly true. I think we asked a number of questions this time that we hadn't asked before, and one of those was a question that we hadn't asked, that I recall, ever, and it was about having formal membership. Oftentimes, I just worked under the assumption that membership really didn't matter, that what really mattered was attendance. And we asked the question, and 86% of them said that they have some sort of formal membership, and that they call it membership or partnership or something like that. But that really surprised me a bit. So that was quite interesting. Another thing that I got asked about, and I went back, it was one of the first things that I looked at when the data was coming in, when we saw that the multi-site phenomena was growing as we expected. We had also asked, where do they have their locations? And I had created a word cloud of all of the locations, but a couple of them stuck out to me. One was a marijuana dispensary. Another was a strip club. There were a number of bars and restaurants. It was interesting that, the typical ones you expect, hotel, theater, high school, something like that. Folks are now kind of branching out to a little less traditional, maybe alt groups and areas. I think partly to signal that, this is not your grandparents' faith. It's in a strip club.
And yet, we had a rise in the number of churches that serve communion more often,
Yes,
and all, which says that the hearkening back to some of the traditional forms, even if we are giving up the organ and the choir more and more,
That's right.
Is appealing. And I suspect that's to the younger generation, because other studies have showed that millennial churchgoers like that ancient future connection.
Yeah, there's some importance to ritual.
So, Christy and Julia and Kelly, who are in the background making the technology work, if there is someone who's got a question voiced, I'll just pause and let that person jump in.
Hi, Warren. This is Bob Smetana from Christianity Today. I got a question.
Hey, and thank you for your article this morning. You are a great writer there, and your move from the Southern Baptist to Christianity Today has been their loss and Christianity's gain.
Well, thank you. I have a question for both of you and Scott, really about like the future of older megachurches. You have in here the kind of challenges or the lack of interest in innovation or ability to innovate. Is there a problem for what does that tell us about the sustainability of older megachurches or the challenges they'll face?
Well, I'll answer first. Yeah. I have a Google alert on oldest church, and a day doesn't go by that 1,000-seat church has dwindled to 75 people, and they're merging, closing, or whatever. So there's definitely a pattern that some cannot sustain. But I also did a book with William Vanderbloemen on pastoral succession, and we looked at high visibility, large church successions, and of course it's the disasters that make the news. But we were surprised at how many 2, 3, 4, 5 generation pastoral successions occur in sustained megachurches. Peachtree Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA largest attendance church, or one of them, in Atlanta, is a great example of how they have gone through now 3 pastors, all long-term and all large megachurch size, without losing momentum. So to summarize, there are many examples of churches that, especially at the pastoral transition, do not continue the momentum, but we found examples of those that do. Scott, Thumma?
Yeah, I think I would have gone the same way there, Bob. It depends on how willing pastors are to transition, to raise up new leadership, to pass the baton. And I think in our data, and I'm going to play with this some more in the coming months when we release some other mini reports, but it seems like those older pastors who probably were the founding, or the pastor when the growth happened, if they're able to transition it to a younger person, the first year or two is often pretty rocky. But once they develop trust with the congregation, I really think it has all the potential to reinvent itself. The younger pastors who have been at the congregation less time are the data shows they're much more likely to use innovative worship. They're much more likely to say that they're willing to change in order to meet new challenges. So I think it really is a matter of handing off power and vision and reinventing yourself with the changes that happen in society.
one more comment, and then we'll go to another question. Multi-site, and Bob, you wrote a very detailed article on the trends in multi-site, but that's really changed everything about the future of megachurches too, in that if the sanctuary size grows smaller, then the next generation doesn't inherit this big gargantuan thing. So, for example, Andy Stanley, North Point, Atlanta, everything is booming, and the deacons say, "Well, Andy, pastor, let's build another. Let's enlarge our 100-seat sanctuary." He says, "No. Let's just build a back-to-back second 3,200, in this case 3,400 seat sanctuary." So they have the east and the west right next to each other. I actually on the website leadnet.org/world. I have a link where I list all the largest sanctuaries, 5,000 and higher in the United States. And I've been tracking those, and fewer that size are built, even though overall churches are getting bigger and bigger. It's because they're using multiple sites. And that speaks significantly to future generations having more flexibility in what they do. Another question?
Hey, Warren, Scott, this is Jim Tomberlin, the multi-site guy. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for the report, and I've just enjoyed digesting and the whole information. One observation and a question. So the mega churches have grown to about 62% now are multi-siting. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that represents about 1,000 mega churches out of the 1,650. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So that represents about 20% of the 5,000 plus multi-site churches. Correct?
Wow. Okay.
Now, I've been saying for a while that, you don't have to be, the multi-site movement began with mega churches, but it quickly outgrew the mega church phenomenon. It's gone beyond being a mega church phenomenon. And I like to say you don't have to be mega to be multi.
And Jim, you helped me do a different survey that's posted as a free download at Leadership Network, leadnet.org. Just search for the word scorecard, where we track that every time we do a survey of multi-site churches, the median attendance size when they launched gets smaller and smaller. So it's down in the thousands, and we found many examples of churches that were viable multi-site churches in the multiple hundreds.
Yeah, well, I think that you concluded that around 1,200 is the average size of a church when it launches its first multi-site campus.
The average, though, there was quite a big spread of the high size and the low size. Yeah.
Well, here's my question: where clearly the megachurch movement has been a big factor in the multi-site movement. In your study of megachurches, were you able to discern any information about how many of these megachurches are involved with the church planting? Do you have any percentage of how many of the 1,600 megachurches are actually involved with planting churches, intentional church plants, I should say? And what do you see in there?
Yeah, we didn't ask that question specifically this time. I believe it was in 2008 was the last time we asked that. And at that point, a church that said they were multi-site were also more likely to be planting churches than single-site churches. So the two went hand in hand in an effort of sort of evangelism and expansion, I guess.
Which really rebuffed the stereotype that said, oh, multi-site and church planting are antithetical, they harm each other. And the reality is, no, if you go multi-site, you're even more likely to plant churches.
Right. And this kind of gets to a second question I asked you earlier, Warren, in an email about, I haven't seen anywhere the latest report from the Southern Baptist, the new church report of church planting in America, did not give any indication of this, of how many churches of the 320,000 Protestant churches across North America have actually been involved with intentionally planting churches as well. Not just mega churches, but all of them. What's the percentage? Nobody seems to have a a guesstimate on that.
And Scott, just before you reply, one of the challenges of answering that question is the level of involvement. Hey, we give to our denomination fund and they plant churches. Does that count?
No.
Is we have birthed a church out of our own church, or middle ground, we have helped co-sponsor a church planter, directly. So
maybe those should be all the three questions.
Yeah. All right, Scott.
You want to fund a study? Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great I think that's a study.
In the 2008 Faith Communities Today study, which Warren talked about all the megachurch studies we've done, we always do them in conjunction with this larger national study of congregations of all sizes and all faith traditions. We did the first, we collaborated with the first study of Muslim congregations and Baha'i congregations, and we have Mormons and everybody else in there. And in 2008, Faith Communities Today asked that same question that we did about church planting. And it was a relatively small percentage, but I think partly because many of those congregations do exactly what Warren said. They belong to a denomination that for a very long time, the denomination took care of those things. It's only been in the last few years,
right,
and mostly, I think, led by the very large churches, not just the current megachurches, but those that used to be the center city churches that probably had a history of planting other congregations in their city. So there is a little bit of evidence, and I can dig that out for you if you'd like, but it's not anything like the megachurch data. But I wanted to go back, if I could, unless you ask about smaller congregations, and I can slip in a little bit of data that's not exactly representative, but we asked that question of congregations that were between the sizes of 500 and 1,800, and about did they offer online, did they consider themselves multi-site? And 36% of those congregations said that they were multi-site, and another 17% said they were thinking about it. So, it certainly isn't just for the big guys, for sure.
Right.
And Jim, we'll be releasing that officially about December 9th, a study of smaller, large churches,
yeah,
less than mega size, and I'll be sure you get a copy of that.
Well, thank you, Warren. Just to wrinkle, your last report, our last survey of multi-site churches reflected, I think, 48% of multi-site churches are also involved with hands-on planting churches, or in some way hands-on planting churches, which, Scott, to your point, there has been, as a major, I think, explosion in the last 10 years of planting churches by local churches. Yeah. versus their denomination, supporting their denomination. And I do think
let me just jump in there. The research Ed Stetzer and I did for what Viral Churches, which at the time was the largest study of church planting anyone had done in the United States, and everything he and I have seen since then validates what I'm about to tell you, is the locus of church planting, which used to be the denomination and then shifted to the district, is now local church creating the movement. So it's churches planting churches, or more accurately, churches birthing church planting movements.
Yes.
That is the clear growing trend for today.
No, and that was where I was going, Warren, is that I think that is the next big wave or wrinkle, or even maybe paradigm shift from just reproducing campuses, reproducing services like a megachurch does, which inevitably they reproduce campuses, but that's not the same as multiplication. Reproducing is when those campuses reproduce, then you start to have multiplication. And I do think the multi-site movement has catalyzed a lot of the energy for planting churches by pastors who may never have considered that until they started down the multi-site path, and they caught the excitement of new congregations, whether you multi-site or plant. And so I do think that's the next big we're going to see more and more churches doing both and.
And let me add one more finding from this survey that we're just talking about today that I think builds into what you've described. We ask, do you have a internship or mentoring program
Yes.
to develop future leaders? And just an astounding 74% said yes, which is we are developing people internally, yes, for our own staff, but also to send them out in various ways as church planters and campus pastors, missionaries, and otherwise. And that has huge implications. And in fact, Dave Ferguson and I are trying to develop those findings a little further.
That's all good news.
Any other questions? Well, hearing silence, I'm sorry, I now hear a voice.
That was just me. I was going to, there are all kinds of findings that we didn't put into the report, many of which fascinate me to no end. But if we have another question, sure.
That's good. Go ahead and go with that placement. Is there anything else we need to talk about?
All right. So I think that's everything.
Oh, okay.
Thank you all for being part of this. This recording will be built into a blog, which will be put onto the leadnet.org/megachurch website. If you want to follow me on Twitter, Scott does not yet tweet. I'm Warren Bird, at Warren Bird, and at LeadNet for Leadership Network. If you'd like a ongoing newsletter about the trends and innovations that we find in larger and growing churches, just go to leadnet.org/advance, and that's a free email. The Hartford's Institute website, hartfordinstitute.org, just has a huge amount of free and helpful research. And Scott, you want to add anything else before our final farewell?
Well, and we also have the Faith Communities Today website at faithcommunitiestoday.org, and we will be releasing some of the 2015 research probably within the next 2 weeks or so on that. So keep an eye out for that.
Well, thank you. And if we can help with your report writing or questions about large churches, we would love to serve you.
Thank you.